is a work in progress. But when I get done with that, this is something I'll share because it's already helped me out with a quick reference guide. There's certain forms that are designed for giving notices in situations that I don't think everybody's aware of. I mean, just some of them I was not aware of. So that's coming. I will not be able to cover everything today that I want because this is the list that I came up with, feasibility. Before the PSA, we have pre-inspection and also for your protection to get a home inspection pamphlet. But there is a pre-inspection process if a buyer chooses to try and do that with the seller before making an offer. So this is before purchase and sale agreements. It's standalone contract. But then when we start writing a purchase and sale agreement, we then have a 35W, 35, 35R, C, and N that are come into play depending on what you're looking for services. And then once they come down, I separated this group of forms here because, let me see if I can drag this down a little bit. I separated them out because these are forms that you can use not only in a structure or a dwelling, but you can also use it in land. There's feasibility contingency, there's 22 LA, there's the well addendum, septic addendum, your title addendums and notices, and a survey contingency addendum. And in looking at this list, I didn't want to overwhelm and try and just speed through them. So what I plan on doing today is taking it as we go and start looking at the 35P and F. I don't know if anybody's ever used one of those or not. I have not used one, but I would like to go over and review it because it's something that is available for us to use. And where is it for? Here we go. Here we go. And here's what it looks like. It's a pre-inspection agreement, so it's a standalone contract and should never be attached to a purchase and sale agreement. It's a completely standalone. And in doing it, it looks fairly similar in that all the rules you will find as far as not giving any of the information discovered by your inspector to the seller, unless it's in writing and requested. And the obligations are very similar in that everything that is being ordered, performed, and is paid for by this buyer. And it's the same rules as far as restoring anything that is disrupted back to its original condition. The sewer inspection is whether it may or may not be performed and be a part of the inspection process. It has to be identified whether it is or not, because if it's a sewer, that means you might have to remove toilets, you might have to do digging things up in pipes and running snakes down and photograph. So that's separated out as something that's negotiated with the seller. Oil storage tanks, there's a lot written on this in that it's only to say if there is one on the property. You're not allowed to do any soils testing or any kind of contamination testing that would bring liability on the seller. You can only say, yep, there's a tank, or nope, there's not. Unless there's written permission agreed to by the seller to do anything beyond that. If there's anything comes out of this, the prevailing party has their legal fees taken care of. And then there's an indemnification from the buyer that if any of their inspectors themselves gets hurt while on that property, the seller's indemnified for it. Now, what I found interesting in this is what happens when you have a report and the buyer sees things that need to be corrected, and then they want to make an offer. And it turns out there's a way of dealing with that, and I do want to go into that. Before I do, this is the product that will be coming out as a quick reference guide. Is what I've done to all of these forms is come down and have the form identified, have the concept of what's going on, what the provision are that's being called for. But if you skim down through here, it saves you from trying to read a full contract. You can see the topic. And then over here on the right-hand side, I've identified the actual page, the line number where you can go right to it in the contract. Okay. So this is the buyer and seller enter into a written agreement. The seller agrees. And if I come down to buyer's obligations, A, B, and C that are written in that contract, I have identified. And so these are the main points that came out. Buyer shall not alter the property. do not use inspection report to try and force the seller to make disclosures in future transactions. And also the buyer shall not give any part of that inspection report to the seller. And these are things I pulled out of the Northwest MLS manual for instructions, because many times you have more information in the instruction manual that relate to how to administer the actual contract. So is somebody trying to say something out there?
Yeah, I'm trying to take the sound off.
Gotcha.
We're good.
We're good? All right.
It was
Technical.
the voice telling you to make sure to follow.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Just to refer to this quickly, this is the manual for Form 35P. And this is where some of the information that I have on that spreadsheet is referring back to, as I try to tie that into it to show you this is where the things are coming from. And so that's where I was mentioning earlier, the liability on the oil storage tank that I mentioned, liability for inspection report, and the RCW that this came from. So in doing that, there's a lot of recently, mostly because the market has turned and cooled off, where people see that we're waiving inspection. For me, that's something that if you really get into looking at the hotline and things, the tremendous liability there is for the buyer by not doing that. There's a form on that I wanted to bring to attention. And this is right out of the Northwest MLS download, and it's for the protection to get a home. And this is where, as a real estate broker, it's another tool for you to be able to educate the buyer, to transmit it and show and demonstrate you transmitted this to the buyer. And in the bottom of it, that says, we have read this document, understand and wish to, we wish to get a home inspection. It is best to do so as soon as possible. So they've been advised to do it. The appraisal is not a home inspection. They also acknowledge that voluntary choice, whether they get a home inspection is done only if we ask for one and schedule it. Your lender may not perform a home inspection, neither the FHA. Your lender may guarantee the condition of the home. Health and safety tests can be included in the home inspection if we choose. If it's something that the buyer's adamant about, I also have the video on this from Annie Fitzsimmons from the hotline, that when I send out the notes for today, I'll include that link if you'd like to watch that video. And then same thing for that video earlier, if that's something you can send to me. I'll put that in the notes too.
Perfect.
Okay. So these are things that can be done before. Now, what I mentioned is, if someone does a pre-inspection, then 35W inspection waiver is an interesting form. This is also a way of us acknowledging that the buyer has requested to waive inspection, but there's some other things in this form. Before I jump to that, there's a couple little things in Form 21 that I'd like to also bring out and review. It's something that is kind of sneaky because it's on the last page of the purchase and sale agreement. There's two areas that, as brokers, we need to pay attention to. A time clock is ticking where your buyer has an opportunity to get out of the contract. And we're always trying to track those and protect that and educate them if there's something that they see that makes them nervous. One of them is in the area for residential dwellings that are built before 1978. This one is where for lead-based paint, that after, I believe it's 3 days, then it expires automatically. But there's a 3-day period that they cannot just kill it. They rescind the agreement. The rescission completely goes backwards in time, where the contract was never signed. It also has other signatures that have to be on it. It also terminates the relationships between the brokers and the buyers and the parties. And a Form 51 rescission is how you put in to get the earnest money back. There's a lot of confusion between Form 50 and 51. Many times people use a rescission agreement, when you really should be using a 50. What I mean by that is that if I use a termination clause within the contract because something expires or for inspection and it terminates, a rescission terminates the agreement. So you can't terminate an already terminated contract. Think about that. If the contract's already terminated, how do you use a rescission to terminate?
Right.
You can't kill something that's already been killed. So in this situation, I just wanted to point out this is a rescission situation. Another thing that on this form is called out is information verification. Buyers shall have 10 days after mutual acceptance to verify all information provided from the seller to the listing broker firm related to the property. This contingency shall be deemed satisfied unless the buyer gives notice identifying the material inaccurate information within 10 days of mutual acceptance. If the buyer gives timely notice of this section, then this agreement will be terminated and the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. In that case, that would be a Form 50 because this is something that you have to terminate and then use a Form 50 to return earnest money. Now, as it turns out, the reason this was written and put into the purchase and sale agreement is for the protection of the seller. Because if this agreement goes past 10 days and this is an exercise, and by the way, it has to be a material inaccuracy, which means it has to be proved. I mean, it has to be something major. But when it closes with this provision and the buyer waiving it, then all future forward in time, if something comes up that's ugly on that property, they cannot go back and sell and sue the seller. It indemnifies, it waives and indemnifies the seller once this deal closes. And that's why this was put in there, is to prevent lawsuits from 5 years or 10 years from now for something that they find and coming back and doing a lawsuit to the seller. But the 10-day period is something that unless you really dive into these contracts, I'm trying to find all of these buried timeframes that are in all these forms that we're going through, because technically the buyers hardly ever read their contracts. It's really up to us to make sure that we bring things to their attention that they should be tracking and help them do that tracking.
Tom, quick question
Yeah.
on that. Is there a specific Form 90 for the information verification period that you would use as a notice, or is it just the generic 90?
I would use a generic 90. There isn't a specific form for it.
Okay.
Okay. Good question.
And Form 50.
And then, yeah, the Form 50.
for the earnest money disbursement.
Yeah. And again, trying to exercise that, there's going to probably be a lawyer come involved with that, because they're going to go in and say, what's the material inaccuracy?
Unless it's plain as day.
Yeah.
Even then, the seller
Even then,
chooses
they always like
to
to
get
argue.
litigious.
Yeah. Okay. So that was Form 21. I thought those two were interesting. I wanted to bring it to everybody's attention. Now, Form 35W, and by the way, that's the same thing that I wanted to keep going back to. Form 35F, it was advisory. Form 21, I have the verification information. I have that summarized on here, and what forms to use. Okay. So now I wanted to go into the waiver form. And this form is very interesting in that it does several things that I wasn't aware of, because it says waiver of inspection is the name. So let me bring that one up. There it comes. Okay. So the first portion of this, again, you really have to document and over document. You can tell how many times Russ has talked about and putting things in that you disclosed your pamphlet for law, for legal pamphlet. This is the same thing for when somebody doesn't want to inspect their property and buy it sight unseen. I mean, I really don't know what they're getting into until you open up a wall or start digging. Buyer has been advised to obtain inspections on the property, including but not limited to this big long list. Buyer elects to waive the right to obtain inspections on the property and purchase. This is something that is attached to the purchase and sale agreement. So checking that box and having the buyer and seller acknowledge that below, all parties in this contract are aware that they've been advised to inspect and they're choosing not to. This is very important. What's more important is down here is the pre-inspection conducted. If we use that first form for pre-inspection, we have an inspection report back and there's some deficiencies that are pointed out in there that the buyer would like to have addressed as making their offer. Then priority mutual acceptance, this is, you check that box and you come down here and it talks about complying with everything. The agreement does not conditioned on the results of such inspection. There's a disclaimer for us. The buyer acknowledges that the decision to purchase the property is based on buyer's prior inspection and that buyer has not relied on representations by the seller, the listing broker, or the buying broker with regard to the condition of the property or suitability of the property for the buyer's intended use. Buyer shall not provide the inspection report or portions of the report to the seller unless seller requests otherwise. And then the next section, if there's an area they would like to have addressed, like have a new roof put on or fix the sidewalk, there's a section in here that says, based upon the results of the buyer's pre-inspection property, the seller shall make the following modifications or repairs to the property described below on the attached pages. So you can reference a Form 34 if you can't fit it all in here. And it's very similar to what they're trying to do in a 35R to say that we'd like to put these in. So we're negotiating.
You're doing it at the time of mutual. instead of
You're doing it
10
the
days
time
later.
before mutual.
Yeah.
Drafting the agreement. Now, the modifications or repairs shall be accomplished at the seller's expense in a commercially responsible manner and according with all the applicable laws, no further than X days prior to closing. So if you have 45-day close, you're using the lender, he has 45 days minus 3 before closing to get all the work done. And also in here is that there's a provision prior to closing, you can have the subject to a reinspection and approval by the inspector who recommended the modifications and repairs. Buyer elects to order and pay for such reinspection. So you have a provision in here. So if I do pre-inspect a house and I do want to make an offer and I like it, I can call things out to be repaired. I have a right to re-inspect it before closing to make sure the repairs are done by the inspector that found the things. So I found that fascinating. I've never used that form. I want to bring it to your attention.
So if they do have the re-inspection at closing, the inspector says they didn't do this right, then is your option just to tell the seller, hey, we're holding off closing? I mean, what's kind of your option?
Well, you would definitely want to have the verbally be doing that, but you would probably put in a 22Y and try and move your time, move your closing date until it could be repaired to your satisfaction.
Yeah.
And so there's,
But then the lender would see that. And then would the lender question?
yeah, the lender would have to see that. You'd have to disclose that.
Mhm.
Here's another interesting thing that it says 3 days. Just because of what you mentioned, Ashley, I would try and put more time in there because I'd like to know sooner rather than just 3 days from closing.
Yeah.
I'd like to know a couple of weeks before closing. So I might put 14 days in there.
Mhm.
And
Time in case they do it.
And that way have that pre-inspection and then there's time to have any little tie-up things done and I don't delay my closing.
Mhm. Okay.
And I there's a lot of these default days on there. That's a great question to ask. Is it really reasonable?
Mhm.
And I'm going to come to that when we talk about 35R, those default days. I mean, well, we'll get to that.
Mhm.
These are things really need to think about. If I need to exercise that, is allow me the time to not have a fire drill and have to do addendums, because if I do a time extension addendum, I got to get the seller to sign it.
Mhm.
What if they say no, and then you have to be forced to go to closing?
Yeah.
So, okay. So on-site sewage disposal system advisory. The buyers advise that on-site sewage disposal systems, including septic system, are subject to strict governmental regulations, occasionally malfunction and even failure. Buyer is advised to consider conducting an inspection and any other on-site system by including an appropriate on-site sewage disposal inspection contingency such as 22S. So this is where when they sign this, they know that you're advising them, you ought to, in this purchase and sale agreement, if they have a septic system, put that in. If there's an on-site sewage that's like a septic system, one thing, but what if it's on a sewer system? So that was why if you had that pre-inspection, it had that in the pre-inspection as a box you could check. So I would make sure in that pre-inspection of having the sewer looked at, advise them to check that box, because in Chelan, for example, Lakeside is probably one of the older neighborhoods around. So those sewer systems have been in there for 40, 50, 60 years. Who knows, in some of those old house, 1924 house. You don't know what kind of tree roots and things are going down. You might like to have somebody open up and turn around and put one of those scopes down there and see if the roots are growing in it and whether it's still good or not.
Does everybody know that Kyle Miller does it as part of his home inspection?
Pardon me, who does that?
Kyle Miller with Corner Piece?
Kyle Miller?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
I
there are
did not know that.
only some inspectors will do that.
I think he's the only one in town that I've heard.
Because otherwise you gotta hire a plumber to do it,
Box
right?
it, Yeah.
Yeah.
So his is, 500 to 700 for the inspection, but you get the value, which is huge. If he doesn't have to pull the toilet, if
Yeah.
there's access.
Yeah.
So he won't do that.
It should be in the street usually.
Yeah.
Like a little port
Mhm.
up there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're basements, yeah.
Yeah.
So on the quick reference sheet over here for 35R, I've gone down what I've gone over verbally. I've tried to do it in bullet format and in short, so you can kind of get the gist of something. If it catches your eye, what you want to know where it is in the contract is identify again on the right-hand side, modifications and repairs, on-site sewage disposal. So I covered those three topics on this sheet, and this is something that I'll send out as a part of the notes for the meeting. I'll send both the forms that are highlighted along with the quick reference sheet. Okay. All right. Any questions on that one before I move on? So now we're moving into Form 35. And how much time do we have right now? Just
12:15.
12:15.
So
What I'm
25 minutes.
Much time as you want.
What I'm going to propose on this is I want to go into Form 35 and 35R in tandem together, because one of them is contract terms and the other one is administration of contract. So they are melded together, but it's like they had to cut the form in half to wait for mutual for the other half to start working. So it's hard to look at one without looking at the other. So what I'm going to recommend today for what time we have left is I'm going to do a quick spin through Form 35 terms. But I have a whole series of hotline questions and answers that I've selected that address different topics of enforcing these terms. And I think if we went through some of those and then come back next week and we turn around and take 35 and 35R side by side and put together, we can then go and walk through and see how they interact with each other. Same thing, I have that reference matrix laid out. It's been proofed by a JR. Here's my guinea pig, okay? And because that allows you to have something that on the same line where the provision is to know exactly where it is in 35R and you have them tied together. And that was what I was trying to do is to get those to tie together like that. Okay. So here we go.
Oh, yeah, that was so cool. Yeah. In the fall, I think he's got the thing. It's so beautiful out there.
If anybody hasn't looked at it recently, the 35R instruction manual is very informative, it's very handy. And this is what I was mentioning earlier. Washington law provides that real estate brokers who directly or indirectly make misrepresentations or allow misrepresentations to be made to a mortgage lender are guilty of mortgage fraud, a Class B felony crime. A real estate broker may unwillingly commit mortgage fraud by omitting information that the condition of the property that is included in Form 35R, if the parties do not reach an agreement in Form 35R, but instead reach an agreement on another form, such as a general addendum form 34. What they did to help limit this is they put verbiage in the 35R that ties it and makes it a part of the purchase and sale agreement. So it's an integral of the contract. We're supposed to give contract addendums onto the lender, and it ties it in. If you make a form 34, the protection of what's in there for how they have that written is you don't have it. Another thing that happens in 35R when you start finding out is the way things are negotiated. If the time period runs out, all of a sudden contingency is waived, and whatever's in that report is sitting there, and it goes forward to closing for whatever's sitting there, not being addressed, not being fixed, or not, and it just kind of hangs there. That's where liability starts coming in, whether it's something you should disclose or not. And that's a big gray area. And I'm going to talk more to Russ about that. I think it's something we really need to have more clarity for us to know how to handle that. So anyhow, I'm wondering if you haven't read that form lately, this manual has a couple of good things. So if I come down through here, oh, there's the buyer response form. I want the, excuse me. Okay. So in the inspection addendum, it's subjective in satisfaction. No matter what happens, the buyer never has to divulge if there's, it's a cloudy day today, so I went out of my agreement. They don't have to disclose anything, and they can get out of it. And it's without limitation. It's stated twice. It's emphatic. Identifies the different types of inspectors. It has a sewer inspection part of this. It may or may not. So there's another selection for this if you want to have a sewer inspection instead of a septic inspection. Buyer's obligations. The buyer's obligated, much similar like the pre-inspection, ordering, performing, paying for. It's almost the same language. Buyer have the responsibility for all damages. Okay. And then the inspection contingency, the default is 10 days. Again, knowing how long and knowing your inspectors you called, you have to decide one. And this is something to think about. Is it enough time to get the inspector to go out and do the inspection? I get the report. But if I want to have an electrician or a plumber or a specialist go out and look for additional inspections, I'll have to trigger that additional inspection request in 35R. Okay. So you want to make sure you have enough time to be able to find out you're going to reach that. Yeah.
I have a quick one on this one. This is more strategy than contracts, but if you do have 10 days or 14 days or whatever it is, sometimes buyers are able to get inspectors in there the day after their mutual, right? They get in there real quick. If there's anything on that inspection report that they want to have an additional specialist look at, I have been recommending, and let me know if this is wrong, but I've been recommending people use the original 10 to 14 days, whatever they put in there, to get that additional specialist in there, rather than kicking a response over, because that response then triggers a separate timeline where you have 5 additional days rather than 10 to 14 days or whatever you put in there. So use your original timeline of 10 days to get specialists in there, because sometimes roofers, it can be hard to find a roofer that could come tomorrow and check out a roof. And if you give them that 35R and tell them you want additional specialists to come out, you trigger oftentimes a much shorter timeline, and you can end up with less time to get an inspection done than if you just use that original 10 to whatever days you put in. Is that sounding right, or are we?
You can do that. But let's talk strategy for a second, because what you're doing is you're saying, if I check the box here that says additional inspection, right?
If you're going to have an additional,
let me just go with you.
Okay.
If I use that box, I trigger paragraph 5 on form 35. So if I hit paragraph 5, additional time for inspection. If you use 5 days, I'd absolutely want to do what you just said.
Yeah.
However, and let me just use an example here. Let's say I had 20 days in inspection, and then 5 days in, I got my inspection report back, and I fill out this form saying I want additional inspection. As soon as I use this form, those days go away. They're no longer there. They're erased.
Yeah.
Now I only have 5 days. So if I had 5 days in on, what did I say,
20.
20? I had another 15 days there, and you're saying I could use those 15 days. Right.
Yeah, you don't
But
need
if
permission
I
to
hit
get the
this, if I hit this, if I hit this, those 15 days go away and now it's replaced by 5, and I just lost that, correct?
Right, yeah,
Unless I put 15 days in there.
right, that's true.
This is what I'm saying. You have to design your contract and use the forms the way they're designed. In this case, there's 2 ways that you can use these forms. You could use all that period of time and say an additional inspections and put that in there. But there's another thing that kicks in here is if I have additional inspections by those specialists, for me to really negotiate this agreement, I want to have estimates from contractors. Because I can give an estimate from a contractor attached to this and send that to the seller. It's not an inspection report. It's a scope of work and cost. Okay. And we're going to go into this more because I'm skimming through this right now, and somehow I also, all of a sudden I'm on 35R. Thank you. That was a good trick. But this is what we're going to go in more detail, but this is where we start talking more about dates the next time we go through. Now, back where I was, you have sewer, you have buyer obligations and notices, your inspection report and not sharing it, and waivers. You have seller consent. If these boxes aren't checked, there's forms where you can do this later and have that consent afterwards be asked for and done. Additional inspections and time frame. You also have buyer's request for repairs and modifications, and this is the area that we're really going to go into because there's a real area to protect your buyer here, depending on how we deal with dates, and also understand that the attention, this is the end, this is a dead end. It does not extend. And then repairs and verifying repairs, oil storage, and neighborhood. So with those timeframes that are filled in, what I was really interested in is saying during the administration of these things, what are the most common things that come up that we really need to be paying attention to? My first hotline is one of my favorite topics. It says on a 35R, it was properly terminate the PSA and deliver the form along with a Form 51 to rescind. The listing broker asked buyer broker to use Form 50 instead of a 51. The buyer broker pushed back. Form 51 is an improper form to use in the situation. Is that correct? Listing broker is correct. Buyer broker should not use Form 51 with a 35R. 35R is a proper form for the buyer to use to terminate. Form 50 is a proper form for buyers to instruct the escrow officer to release the earnest money. Form 51 is a rescission agreement. If signed, it would rescind the PSA. However, if the buyer has already terminated the PSA, as the buyer has done by submitting Form 35, then what are the parties going to rescind? And that I just wanted to verify that. Now, when I go through these, I'd like to know if there's an interest from you, if you would like me to put copies of these and give you a copy of these, because over the last 11 years, I've hit the same thing over and over again. What I found if I collect these things is sometimes I want to have a relationship with the other broker that I'm dealing with, the other side of the transaction, that is healthy and strong, and we work together. And if they don't know something that I do, how are they going to receive being told they're wrong or need something else? And then, so sometimes by saying, hey, I saw a question answer on this, and I can give it to them, and Annie can be the bad person,
Yeah.
instead of me, and saying, I'm just sharing this with you. But so for me, it ended up being a tool. And it's just a matter of whether, if I've already searched all this stuff out, if it's something that you want me to attach when I send things out, I'd be happy to do that.
So the overwhelming answer was yes, attach it.
Yes.
Oh,
Attach them.
okay.
And that's,
I'm
Yeah.
just thinking, how do you keep it all organized?
I have them numbered. There's a 02, 03, 04. They all line right up. So here the 35R. How do we attach? Okay, 35. The buyer option requests additional inspection, but it states the inspector's recommendation is attached. How do we attach this when it is a part of the inspection report? Let's skip down. Buyer broker, take the page or pages of the inspector's report that include the recommendation for additional inspections and redact all information, including pictures, except the few words necessary for the seller to recommend additional inspection. Inspector's recommendation for an additional inspection typically requires no more than a few words. It does not include a summary of work that inspector did or what the inspector found. The recommendation typically looks something like recommends further evaluation by siding contractor, electrician, or plumber. And that's it. Those are the only words that should be provided in the list of the broker. Everything else around those words on the relevant page should be redacted and blacked out.
And I would say one time I used the redaction tool in Authentisign and it is crap. You can see right past it. So don't use it.
Yeah.
It,
Yeah.
yeah, it really won't fit me in the app.
Now, I don't know what software I have. I use Adobe Acrobat, the standard. And what I have found is if I redact, if I take something and if I go to properties here, if I, let me just give a demo. If I come over here and I say fill color and I do it to black, that's great. But if I email this to you, Ashley, you could open it up and come in here and go, whoop.
You'd have to flatten it.
So, no,
So it
no,
saves a
no.
PDF.
So the only way that I get out of that is if I turn around, I come up here and I hit print, and I print the PDF,
Mhm.
that document's locked up. You can't change it. You
Flattens
can't
the
move it.
elements.
So that's one of my procedures. Once I make that, I turn around, I hit print to PDF, and once that comes out the other end, I usually put a initial at the end of it, so I know I did that to it. Put a B, I put a B on the end of it. And then that's what I attach, and then that's what I send. And that way they can't mess with it, but they won't be able to see it. And it blacks it out really
So
good.
that would be shady anyways, but.
Yeah.
Some people suck.
Well, I try not to be shady.
Yeah.
Yeah.
no, that's-
I try.
One
Where Marcia makes me
quick tip.
really hard,
If you do use a text box in the Authentisign and uncheck transparent background, it will white out everything behind that text box.
Mhm.
So that's a hack if you are
Yeah.
stuck in transaction desk and you can't get into Adobe. But
Gotcha.
Okay. So here's another one that I found interesting. Like I said, I try not to duplicate. Oh, I changed things. There we go. I try not to duplicate topic. I'm looking, I've went through 150 of those things. Then there's so many, I'm asking the same question over and over and over and over again. But I try to find ones of different topics. And so this one is, I represent a buyer in this situation. We're asked the seller to replace the sewer line from the house to the main sewer. We did receive a bid from a qualified contractor to do the job. The listing agent is now asking if they can have the bid. If I send it over, the bid to the listing agent, is that the same as sending over an excerpt from the inspection report? Could it put the buyer in a situation where they're waiving the inspection because of sending over the bid? Buyer broker may send the bid to the work to be completed at seller's house, and that will not waive buyer's inspection contingency. Buyer is prohibited from sending any portions of the buyer's inspection report to seller without seller's consent. A bid for work to be completed at seller's home is not an inspection report. Buyer broker may send the bid without risking buyer's inspection contingency. So I
Okay,
really,
So then this goes back to the whole fraudulence thing.
it
With,
could.
with loans, right? So now what if you're doing your entire thing, buyer side knows why, bad roof or whatever, and so you just send the bid of the bad roof
To the seller.
to the seller, and the seller just gives you that money. Is that, so now we're not in fraud because we're not talking
Well,
about the inspection
But
report?
well, wait a second, because right now, we don't have anything determined. It's just a request.
Right,
If we go work this all the way through and there's an agreement for the repair to be made, then the final end that would be shared is that they had it repaired and the repair was fixed. No big deal.
but what if that money from the bidded contractor ends up going to
For
payment buy down
the
or
deed, for the deed.
closing costs, or it doesn't actually
Then
go
that would be
to-
part of the contract.
But it would
And the
need to go to
contract,
the
and the
lender.
contract should be shared with the lender. I mean, that you,
Yeah.
the contract and all contract addendum should be shared with the lender. So that would be the solution. Now, the lender would want to know, is the buyer going to fix it with the money that they was given to them? I don't know. That's between the buyer and the lender. But you have done your job.
Okay.
Okay.
Even though we're not disclosing that the 20 grand is for a roof.
Well,
I mean, it
and there's,
theoretically is, but
there's,
the contract's not saying that. You're using it for leverage.
well, it depends. I mean, you're trying to get the repair done if that's what your buyer wants.
Mhm.
If the seller comes back and says, I don't want to do the work, I'll give you so much money to reduce, then you do the work. There's a negotiation going on there about who's going to do the work.
Mhm.
Now, if it ends up being money that's designated to do the work by this, that's credited to the buyer, that's up to the buyer to follow through and do the work.
Okay.
Well, sometimes the buyer can't get 20 grand as a credit because it's worded as credit. for
That's-
closing costs.
that's-
That could be too much money, and then it doesn't go back to them. They can't just get money at closing.
That's why the lender has to be involved, because then maybe the lender would say, we would like to have a trust account set up. So when the work is done by the contractor, that money will go towards being released to pay for it.
Oh, like escrow hold back, is that what? Gotcha.
Yeah, you just have a escrow account set up for that. Or you can turn around and I've done this, is the contractor do the work and then get the money at closing. So, I mean, there's several ways of problem solving.
Did that answer your question? I didn't-
I'm still trying, I mean, it just feels like a real gray line between where I'm trying to understand where the line is of fraud and becoming creative. and-
Fraud is that you know something and you willfully held it back and some material change to the house, to the property. Replacing the sewer line is a material change.
Mhm.
I wouldn't want to argue that one. I think it's material change.
Mhm.
So if that's the case, when this is done and finalized, it should be shared with the lender.
Even if it's a 35R saying seller's gonna replace the roof. Because I was always thinking, I never want the lender doesn't need to
Yeah.
see the 35R. If any monies, credits towards.
That's
closing
why I
costs,
think we have to have
understand
Russ
credit.
give us some clear direction on that,
I'm-
because
yeah,
I don't
'cause
like
I-
to-
'cause I've
I don't want to send them the 35R.
Been in transactions where this kind of stuff has happened, where
This-
kind of,
this-
there's conversations, there's negotiations that happen. Lender never knew about it.
Mhm.
But now I'm thinking through this fraud thing, like, well, was that fraud? Because we knew about this stuff, but we've decided just to do a credit so the buyer could do it, but we kind of held that back from the lender.
Well, I think lenders getting
I'm
info
really
that's a
not clear.
credit, we should always send them, we just put it on a form 34 instead of the 35R. I just say, see form 34 and it'll say credit of $5,000 towards closing costs. And
So
I
see,
would
this
send it
is-
back to the lender.
And
whether you have a
that's the
35R or not,
final.
you have to read the first
Yeah.
line
Yeah.
in line 1. The following is part of the purchase and sale agreement.
Yeah, but I
It-
don't want to send them that one.
It's part of this, it's part of the purchase
I
and
always
sale
thought I
agreement.
wasn't supposed to send them that form if it talked about repairs, because they're like, oh, I don't want to know.
I've
about
heard that
things."
advice as well.
Yeah, I'm really unclear on like
Yeah.
what could bite you and what
Mhm.
So that's,
good on this.
because I mean,
Because,
all I
mean,
can do right now is tell you that that's the contract.
I'm
Yeah.
waiting on hold for
And by the
5
way,
minutes for this phone call.
There's,
Sorry.
but there are so many of these situations that should be no problem because how it's handled and how it's resolved. Now, before I get off of this one, there's one other thing I think is important. The relationship between you and the listing broker is extremely important. And if you just out of the blue send them a form 35R with a contractor estimate attached and zip it over to them on your request, and they get that cold, seller and broker might get fired off about that, like you just shot at them and developed a bad relationship out of that for the rest of these negotiations. And so care should be taken and turn around and call the other broker and say, we're going to send in a 35R. We want to replace the sewer line. I've got an estimate from a contractor, reputable contractor. But we can make the request without attaching it, or I can make the request with attaching it. Does your seller want to see the estimate from the contractor?
Yeah, warming people up is.
And then they can make a choice on that. I can send it over with or without. But that's just something, lessons learned. We got to watch out how we manage our broker on the other side of a transaction. So I thought that was a good one. Now, what time are we? Are we over overtime?
We're at 12:38, so we're almost an hour in.
Okay,
I have 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
2 minutes and 30 seconds.
Oh, yes, just got them on the timer.
All right, okay.
Closing remarks?
By the way, is this working for you? Because we're gonna go back and really look how these jam together, but I thought if we went through some examples that are right there, when we come back and start reviewing the contract in 35R, we'll see it differently and get more out of it going through.
Will we be?
And I'm
going
not in a
over-
race. I mean, I want to go at a pace that works for everybody.
I think more of us are familiar with 35 and 35R than perhaps 35F and feasibility and all the different
Yeah.
animal that vacant land and prepping it for building is. So we'll be getting into that in a week or two.
Yep, we sure will. I have 20
exciting.
forms up there that are all related to every kind of inspection you
That's
can
good.
think of going
Yeah.
through. But the key thing is, as many times as I've used these forms in the last 11 years, there's something new pops out. It seems like every time. It really is. And that's why at some point, looking at what we've done over the last 6 months, I think it's gonna be time to go back and revisit some of these things. Especially since we have new brokers coming through. And before we wrap things up, does anybody in Zoom have any questions or any comments? I guess that answered that.
Yeah.
Okay. So with that, I say next week we'll kind of pick up where we go. If I have some more examples I'd like to go through, and then I really would like to go through looking at both of those at the same time. But I think with these examples, it'll mean more to us doing that.
Did you pull up on wherever it was? I think it was in the like manual thing where it said if you wanted more info on the mortgage fraud to go, it said to like go. somewhere.
Legal bulletin 180.
Dang,
Legal
shoot,
bulletin
never-
180.
And you'll get that in your
Oh,
handout because here's
'cause I'm
legal
just real stuck on,
bulletin 180 right here.
not gonna send the lender thing, let's see it.
So I'd be happy to include that. What I'm going to do, my Excel spreadsheet that we're working off is already up to like 14 pages, so I'm not going to send the whole thing out. So what I'm really going to do
Layout is probably nice.
is pardon me,
The layout is really nice, though, I like it.
you like that? Okay, thank you. I was wondering if driving people crazy or not, but
Mhm.
what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap everything into notes for email by form so that this is only a one pager. If I have examples for questions, if I have an overview, and then that email goes out, and that way, if you save your emails
Mhm.
in an order for which you have, you can go back and not have to try and look through 14 pages of a big long spreadsheet, that they should be all by topic, okay? That's how I have it designed right now, and that's how I plan on sending it out. So when I send this one out, it'll just have that section we had today, and then I'll check with you next week to see if that worked for you. Okay, hey, thank you, appreciate it. See you next week.
I read through all 14 pages of it yesterday.
Oh, boy.
His eyes were glazed over. We took him downstairs and gave him a drink.
Yes, yes.
Say goodbye. everybody.
Goodbye, everybody on Zoom. Take care.